Welcome to episode 42 of the Empowering Ability Podcast.
Welcome to the Empowering Ability Podcast, where we get you and your loved ones impacted by disability the information needed to live a full and meaningful life. Now here's your host, Eric Gall.
Hey folks, welcome to the podcast. It's been a while since I've recorded a podcast, so it's fun to be back in the host seat and talking to you. So for me, life got pretty busy there just before Christmas in 2017. I was helping a lot with my family business, finishing the construction of my new home, which has been an awesome project to work on and a real privilege. And also working with my sister and her support circle to put together the plan and the strategy to help my sister move out of my parents' house, which has been incredible to be a part of and to watch my sister go through that incredible growth phase. I've also been working with leaders and families who have a loved one with a disability as a coach. That's something that I've been told that I need to promote more to help other families and other leaders to really build and design lives and organizations that they want to make the difference that they want in the world. So that's a big part of what I do, and I have a business around that. So if that's something that you're interested in, feel free to reach out to me about that, and I'd be honored to have a conversation with you. And as well, also working on what we're going to talk about today. We've been doing a ton of research on adult siblings, and the guest today that I'm going to bring on is Helen Ries. Helen and I, along with a third adult sibling, Becky Rossi, have been really focusing on this work. So just a little bit of housekeeping that I want to do before we bring on Helen. So the pace or the cadence of the podcast release last year was about once every week. So moving forward, I'll be releasing an episode about every 2 weeks. So last year it was pretty hectic trying to get a podcast out every week. I'm pretty proud that I was able to release 42, and I've got some pretty good feedback on those. And I feel that episode 41 was much better than episode 1 and episode 2, episode 3. So I feel there was some good improvement there. But yeah, so something just had to give for me with all the priorities that I had going on. So we're going to go every other week. It's to publish about a 1 hour episode. To give you an idea, it's about 10 hours of work. And but yeah, so I've been recording some content over the past 4 months. So I've got some good conversations and podcasts teed up for you guys the next couple months here, and and looking forward to get back into some more podcast recording. So that'll be exciting. I just want to also express the deep gratitude that I have for the podcast guests in those first 41 episodes. Without those guests, the podcast would not be possible. So thank you for sharing your insights. Thanks for giving us the time and contributing to all of our learning. And for you listeners, I hope that you really gain some value, gain some different perspectives, and were able to learn from the guests that I had on in those first 41 episodes. And you're going to continue to get that experience going forward. I'm going to work really hard at that. But I'd love to hear from you guys around what really resonated with you in those first 41 episodes. It'll help me to really dial in and focus on the content and the guests that are really providing you value and you're finding valuable. So I'd love you to send me an email at Eric, E-R-I-C, at ericgall, Goll.com, and just tell me what episodes you might liked, what topics you were digging, and it'd be great to get that feedback from you or anything that I can improve on as well. Open to guest suggestions as well. If there's someone you'd like to hear from on the podcast and hear their perspective and insights, really open to that. You can also find us on Facebook by searching Empowering Ability. You can also go to the website at empoweringability.org. So every 2 weeks, expect some new content, a new episode along with the blog. So the podcast is currently free. I'm considering the idea of a pay as you can type model. So for those of you that are getting a ton of value from the podcast and you have the means to contribute towards the production and work that goes into this podcast, then you'd be able to contribute. This is something that I'm working on putting together, starting to build. So I'll keep you updated, and you'd also get any resources that I build and that I'm working on. So, however, I want to make sure that this information stays widely open and available to everybody. So those are just some of the thoughts on where we're going, and that's enough of the housekeeping. So the guest today, as I mentioned, Helen Ries. Helen is an adult sibling who supports her brother Paul. Helen also joined me on episode 9, where she goes into pretty extensive depth on her story as a sibling. She gives you a high-level version of that story in this podcast, but if you want to hear more depth on Helen's story, her experience, and her insights from her experience, check out episode 9. So Helen's a sibling. She is a collaborator, and she's a evaluator. So she works with organizations to help them assess, are they doing what they said that they're going to go do? And to look at their programs. So that's enough for me. Let's welcome Helen on and start the conversation. Hey, Helen. Welcome to the Empowering Ability podcast.
Hi, Eric. How's it going?
Awesome. It's a pleasure to have you back on the show. So Helen did a previous podcast with me in episode 9, sharing her experience as a sibling. So excited to have Helen back on the show. Helen and I have been doing quite a bit of work since the last podcast that we recorded together.
Right.
So the purpose of this podcast is to kind of share that work more broadly. We haven't really had the opportunity to do that yet. So
no. And we have to say that there's actually a third person who's been sharing in the workload.
Yes.
Her name's Becky Rossi, and she can't be on the podcast today because she's having a baby.
Yeah, she might be in the hospital as we speak. So
Right. But I'm sure she was disappointed not to be able to join us.
Yeah. And so for those of you that this is the first Empowering Ability podcast you may have listened to, or maybe you haven't listened to the podcast with Helen and I previously, we are both siblings, as is Becky. So maybe, Helen, that might be a good place to start, just to briefly give a high-level overview of kind of you and your experience as a sibling. And I can do the same, and we can do the same for Becky as well.
Right. My story is that I live with my brother Paul and my husband. I became very suddenly Paul's primary supporter because both of our parents passed away, one right after the other. It's been 3 years now that I've been supporting Paul, and it's been both a challenging and very rewarding experience. I think that Paul is thriving, and our relationship has grown, and I've grown as a person as well.
Yeah, and it's been awesome getting to know you and Paul over the last little bit, and I know that you play a huge role in Paul's life. So I think that's pretty cool.
Right.
So,
and you?
Yeah, for me, so about 3.5 years ago, I was living in a different city in Waterloo at the time, Waterloo, Ontario, and working there for a tech company. And I visited my family maybe once a month, something like that, and spoke over the phone with my parents maybe on a weekly basis in separate calls. And my sister Sarah, who has a developmental disability, a couple of years older than I am, we would chat on Facebook once in a while. And there was just this huge mounting tension between really my mom and my sister, my mom being the primary caregiver for my sister, to help her with whatever she needed help with, to assist with her disability. And anyways, it was kind of the ticking time bomb went off, and I get a phone call from my mom, pretty distressed, saying that she basically couldn't do it anymore, and my sister Sarah had to move out. And for me, that was a reflection point of the role that I wanted to play in my family, as a brother and as a son. And so it was kind of a point where I either stuck my head in the sand or I jumped in with 2 feet and helped to find a solution. So
I think that's why we one of the reasons why we've connected is because there's some commonalities in our stories, like both of us having to jump in with both feet, both of us having changes in our career paths because of having jumped in with both feet, and we have a few other points in common as well that I think that this journey brings for everybody. Yeah,
and some weird points as well in terms of like education, both having an MBA and stuff, which is just kind of weird coincidence. But
and Becky too.
Yeah,
the other thing, Becky as well. So yeah, that's really strange.
Yeah. Did you want to maybe share a bit about Becky's story, Helen?
Sure. So Becky, she has been involved with Partners for Planning for quite a long time, and she's the sibling of an adult brother with Asperger's syndrome. So Becky, I know that Becky and her brother are quite close, and she, I guess with her sister and her parents, have worked really hard to create the best life for her brother, and to also to keep their family strong and to secure their collective futures. Becky, like us, is quite dedicated to her brother, and works hard for him.
Yeah, and she is a ball of energy as well, which has been great to keep us motivated and moving ahead as a team. So
right,
which has been awesome.
She lives here in the same city as I do, although we hadn't met each other before, and the disability community is quite small. So it was nice to meet her and to know that she's in the same town.
Yeah. Now that I think of it, I haven't met Becky in person yet.
Oh.
So, yeah.
Oh.
I'll have to do that sometime.
Yeah.
Meet her and her newborn.
Her newborn, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So everybody kind of has a little bit of an idea of our journey, or a snapshot of our journey. And so that's really what brought us all together, in realizing that siblings can often get forgotten in the conversation. And, looking at our stories, I think we've all played really important roles in our brother or sister's lives and our family's lives. So Helen, I guess really you were kind of kicked this off and brought me on board, and then we kind of brought Becky on board. But do you want to maybe share like where we started from, and where maybe bring us forward to where we've gotten to so far today?
Right. Well, the whole issue of siblings being left out of the conversation is certainly something that I face in our family. So my parents had great plans, but they hadn't really shared them with me. And I was sharing this story with Rebecca Pauls from Planned Lifetime Advocacy Network. And Rebecca and Plan have become very interested in the sibling journey as well, because of the aging population and what they're seeing in their own lifetime membership. And at the same time, Dr. Yona Lunsky of the Center for Addiction and Mental Health was also quite interested in the sibling story. She's also a sibling and working on issues of mental health and developmental disabilities. So there were these two other folks sort of, engaging in conversation with me. And we landed on the idea of having a sibling conference. So that's not really an original idea. They have a huge sibling conference in the United States every second year as part of the Sibling Leadership Network. And, the issues in the United States are really quite different than those here in Canada. It's just the issue of Medicare alone, or how they pay for their health care. I don't even understand it, but is a dominant issue that we don't necessarily face. We have other kind of funding issues. So the idea percolated of pulling together a conference. And I think I had met you at that time, Eric, through Alan Mansky, who put us in touch. And you very wisely said, Helen, hold the phone. Do siblings really want to have a conference? Because, I still really thank you to this day for asking that very important question before we launched headfirst into putting together a conference that potentially wasn't needed or wanted. So what we did then is we decided to ask siblings. So we have a Facebook page for siblings that has been running for a little while now. We have quite a large membership of siblings from Canada, and we sort of thought to ask that group and then some others, would you like to get together? So have I told the story as you expected, Eric?
Yeah, and I'm grateful that you invited me into that conversation, because just on a personal level, it's really helped me understand the experience that I've lived as a sibling, and that journey, which I want to share in a moment here. But for people that are interested, Helen, how can they, if they go to Facebook, what do they search for to join that group?
It's the Sibling Network.
Okay, so just go to Facebook,
just
Sibling Network, and you can join there.
Right, and it's a closed Facebook group, so there's a number of administrators, and we'll approve you in. And it's just a place to chat, to pose questions, to post, articles and stories. So we there is a very large sibling Facebook page, again, out of the United States, and it's also quite valuable. So it's called SibNet. So if you wanted to join both, that I'm sure you'd find it very interesting if you're not already connected to both. The difference, again, is, in Canada, we face some different issues politically, of course, and around funding and perhaps even the culture of care. So that's why we've sort of hived off to this Canadian sibling network.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So I come from always the methodology of, I guess I like to think about it in terms of being a philosopher and a scientist. So we had you kind of shared with me the philosophy, or the idea of, hey, siblings want a conference. And then the scientist in me is like, let's prove it. So
right.
we took that hypothesis, right, and tested it, and that's really where we are today. So we sent out a survey, or we created a survey and sent it out to really understand the sibling experience. And we were fortunate enough to have 400 siblings, adult siblings across Canada, either reply to the survey and some of them even engaged in phone interviews with us to share their experience, which was extremely valuable. So we're excited to share some of those findings and that we had, and recommendations that we have also coming out of learning more about siblings.
Yes, that survey, I have to say, it was amazing to get 400 people responding to the survey in, I think it was 6 weeks, which is an extraordinary number of people. And we couldn't have done that actually without Partners for Planning that has a wonderful, an extensive mailing list and they sent it out for us, as did Community Living Ontario, who wrote an article and sent out the link to the survey as well. So we had a lot of help to get the 400 siblings outside of our Facebook page. And it was really emotional for me reading or watching the results come in and reading some of the comments, because it was really validating. I felt like my experience as a sibling had been very much a lonely journey. Well, until I'd met you and Becky and a few other siblings that I'm friends with, but I really didn't have an extensive network, especially siblings that are doing some quite extensive care. And so, yeah, the survey was quite an event for us, I think. Wouldn't you say?
For sure, yeah. And I think just the emotion tied into it, right? And then it was interesting trying to look at those findings and detach the emotion and look at the facts.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Which can be a challenge when you're so close to that experience, right? But,
exactly.
Yeah. Like, just to share that gratitude, like, for P4P and Community Living Ontario and Plan out in Vancouver. And also, to the 400 people or 400 adult siblings that replied. Just super grateful for you taking the time to answer that survey for us. So I think if I could just share maybe the sibling life journey or experience that we kind of see, and this is at a high level, but is it okay if I share that, Helen? And
go for it.
You can feel free to chime in with anything that you want to add, or maybe I missed, or maybe I'm wrong. But so I think we really started to come to this conclusion, or draw these, I won't call it conclusion, but draw these insights through conversations with siblings, and also correlating that to what we were seeing with the data from the survey that was coming in. And then I think also using our experience as a benchmark as well. So we kind of looked at the data from the survey, but also the experiences as a sibling like in life stages. So we kind of looked at, not necessarily in the survey, but kind of qualitatively in this sibling life journey, from the time we're born up to about 20 years old, being the stage where, as a sibling, you really you start to gain an understanding for disability and for your sibling, and that might come closer to your teenage years. But prior to that, really, we see, or have noticed, that siblings mature faster, and they mature faster than the average person. So, to give a personal example, at 5 or 6 years old, I would see my mom helping my sister get ready in the morning. And, if I saw days where my mom was sleeping in or whatever, and my sister was getting up, I would jump in to help my sister get ready for the day. And that's not necessarily a typical thing a sibling would do for another sibling, but just finding ways to step in and support. And because of those types of experiences, just I guess always wanting to support and care, but I think that contributes to a lot of siblings maturing faster than the typical or average person.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then there's also this, I guess, protector role that can develop in siblings at a younger age as well. So no one's going to mess with your sibling, because and I guess this is for all siblings, but I think it's especially for siblings that have another sibling with a disability.
Right.
So we see those commonalities among siblings kind of in their younger years, we'll say up to about 20. And then a lot of us go on to university, right? 18, 17, whatever that is these days, college, and we move out and we get our first job. And as siblings, we go into that next stage of life, and next stage of growth, where our sibling with a disability or developmental disability doesn't have typically that same opportunity. So they'll stay in school till 21, and then they'll, what's being called age out. They're kicked out of high school at that point, and they often, will sit at home. In my sister's case, sat at home in my parents' basements for the better part of 10 years, which is thankfully changing, but which takes a lot of work to basically start at ground zero with that. But there's this, real growth stage for us as siblings, and then we see our brothers or sisters kind of go stagnant. And there's this, a lot of siblings call it a feeling of guilt, and wanting those same opportunities for their brother or sister, but not really knowing how.
When it's also not our call, like our parents are
Right.
making that call. So I know that feeling of guilt and, desire to help or change, but it wasn't my domain. And I'm sure you can identify with that too.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that continues for a lot of siblings into their 30s, because it's just kind of a next stage or next evolution of growth, right? It's career building, it's starting a family, and those things take up a lot of energy. So that guilt can still exist because you see your sibling, a lot of people with disabilities still living with their parents into their 30s. And it's still that same experience of, wanting better for your brother or sister with a disability, but not necessarily having the energy or having the influence or the power to help facilitate that for them. And then I haven't experienced this, but maybe you can share your experience to it, Helen. And sorry, I think I just aged you there. So into when adult siblings get into their 40s, I had it described to me by a sibling, and I think this encapsulates it well, as this looming feeling. And they described it as they could see this, I guess, impending crisis of their parents aging, and they're not really being active or not being included in the planning for what's going to happen when the parents can no longer provide the support that they're providing for their son or daughter with a disability. And the sibling realizing that they're kind of the next person in line, and they feel that responsibility to provide that support for their brother or sister with a disability.
Right.
And Helen, I know that you've kind of lived through this, so maybe did you want to add to
sure.
that with your experience?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in my experience, I felt the looming a little earlier. In my 30s, in my late 30s, I moved from Toronto back to my hometown of Ottawa to be closer to my brother, because I thought to myself at that time, I need to be closer to my mom and my dad and my brother for the future. In our family's case, the future came really fast. It came when I was in my mid 40s, when my parents passed away, and I think that's atypical. I think I perhaps experienced that maybe a decade earlier than what people would typically experience that in. But I certainly felt that looming for a very long time and acted on it, like I said, in my mid-30s.
And really the data that we collected from the survey that we'll dive into a little bit deeper represents what you're saying in terms of siblings experiencing that in their 50s, that increased responsibility. And we can't definitively say this because we don't have enough data to support it, but I think anecdotally and just from conversations that we've had, we know that a lot of siblings encounter that increased responsibility, which often throws the family into a crisis situation, because it means that parents' health is declining, which increases that responsibility level that the sibling feels for their brother or sister with a disability. And at the same time, they're likely trying to manage their own family. They might have kids of their own. They might have a career. So that's an incredible amount of life to be trying to live and to manage all at one time.
Right. Yeah. So we didn't find that specifically, like Eric says, or like you said, we didn't have enough data to definitively say that, but we know that from the stories that we've heard and from the people who comments in their survey, and from the experiences of a few others.
Yeah. So I imagine up to this point, some adult siblings listening, or the adult siblings listening to this, are probably nodding their head or connecting with quite a bit of what we're saying. And I think the first time that we kind of pulled this together, we're like, holy crap, like this is me, or like strongly connect with that. And for me, it helped me to kind of understand the experience, but also like I'm early 30s, right? So it gives me an understanding of what a lot of siblings are experiencing, and being able to think forward and design how that could be different.
Right. And I think we have to acknowledge too that, our siblings are living longer. So I don't think we're the first generation necessarily. I certainly don't have any evidence of that, but I think it's a growing trend that people with developmental disabilities, because of great lives in the community, because of good healthcare, are living longer. So, perhaps this is and they're not living in institutionalized settings. So they're out in the world, and that's maybe why brothers and sisters we're starting to notice that there are a number of brothers and sisters facing this sort of, as you said, like a crisis point in their midlife.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's accurate. So would it be a good point to maybe jump into some of the findings and recommendations that we have from the survey?
Sure.
I guess maybe before we get there, did you want to share, I guess, where siblings can read more deeply, or like kind of actually read through the Understanding the Siblings Experience report that we're sending out?
Right. So Partners for Planning will be hosting our report on their website. We don't have the URL for it yet, but we will make it available through our Facebook page. We're hoping Partners for Planning will share it as well, and maybe some of our other community partners will share the report. So keep your eye open for it as of April 10th. It'll hopefully be live, and you're also welcome to contact us directly if you can't seem to find it and you would like a copy.
Perfect. Yeah, and we'll include the links with in the show notes of the podcast and in the short blog that'll go along with this as well.
Perfect.
Okay, cool. So let's dive into some of the findings. We're not going to share all of them, but if you're interested, go ahead and take a look at the report, and you can read through all of those for sure. But we'll share kind of our maybe top one or two each. Helen will share the ones that stick out for her the most, and I'll share the ones that stick out for me the most. Yeah. So I guess for you, Helen, what really, connected with you or opened your eyes with the data that we collected?
Right. So I was, of course, selfishly interested in knowing were people having the same experience as me. And I guess the one finding I was very interested in was, where are siblings living? I was wondering if siblings were living with their brothers and sisters. We should probably say that the bulk of the respondents, although it was a national survey, it was available to anybody in Canada, the bulk of our respondents did come from Ontario. And I think that might be significant in different ways. But for the living arrangements, what we found is that about 85% of the young people, 20 to 29, were their brothers and sisters with a developmental disability were living with their parents. And that's about double what is the national average. So we had a look at what Statistics Canada said about the number of young adults living with their parents, and Stats Canada says it's about 35%. Mm-hmm. So there's double the rate. And I was interested in, especially as siblings got older. So the number of siblings who answered our survey who were in the 50 plus years was much lower than in the younger years. And I think maybe that's a reflection of how we sent out the information. And we found that siblings were, as they got older, moving, of course, from living with the parents who are probably aging out or passing away to other living arrangements, such as living with their brother and sister, they're living with their sibling, living in a group home, and in some cases, even some institutional living, such as a long-term care facility or a hospital environment. So the living arrangements certainly changed in the later years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find that super interesting as well. And so I'm just taking a quick look at the data now, and looking at siblings that live with their parents, right? Like 85% living with their parents, from 20 to 29 is a huge number. But, even when we look at people with a disability that are between 40 and 49%, the data that we collected is showing 58% of those siblings are still living with their parents.
Right. It stays high. It stays high for a long time. And I mean, that was the case in our family, and I think yours as well, where our brothers and sisters were living at home, in my case, until our parents died.
Right. Mm-hmm. And that's when families experience those crisis situations.
Right.
And like with your story, that fell on you.
Exactly.
Is there anything else that you wanted to add to that one, Helen?
It was interesting to me also how many siblings were living alone. It starts out quite a small percentage, between 20 and 25. So we found about 6% of brothers and sisters with a disability were living alone at that age. And then got a little bit bigger over time. And I know there's a lot of work being done right now to have people with developmental disabilities living alone in their own apartments and with some supported independent living, let's say. So be curious to know, it's not in our data, but be curious to know how that might change over time, that maybe we will see, if we were to repeat the survey in 5 years or in 10 years, we would see that there would be more siblings living alone. Mm-hmm. I was surprised to see how many brothers and sisters with a developmental disability were not living with their brothers and sisters. So I guess in my personal experience, I just thought, well, what other option are there? There are no other options. So of course he's going to live with me. And I didn't even consider that there would be another choice. Like, I think I wouldn't want my brother to live in a group home anyway, but I think the list is apparently like decades long. So I thought that to live with a brother or sister would be really the only choice, but it doesn't look like that's really happening. The numbers do go up, like in the between 40 to 49, it's about 10% are living with their brother and sister. And then between 50 and 59, it goes up to 24%. So there is a jump, but it's still a small number, much smaller than I had expected.
Yeah. And I think you make a really good point about there being I think there's a lot of good work being done to help people with and families to think about what living on their own or having a home of their own would look like.
Exactly.
And starting there, rather than just assuming that, oh, okay, they're going to go live with their brother and sister, or they're going to go into a group home. Much different thinking. And that's, I mean, why shouldn't someone with a disability or a developmental disability have that opportunity?
Right. And, I always talk about my relationship with my brother as being a very privileged relationship because we actually like each other and we actually get along most of the time pretty well and make good roommates, but I could certainly see that wouldn't be for everyone. Plus, I have this incredibly laid back husband who doesn't seem to mind living with Paul either. So our situation is quite unique. I think that living with a brother and sister could be quite stressful.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, when looking at my family's plan and my sister's plan, what she wants to do, my sister Sarah is actually going to live with me for a couple of years here in the next future. So she's working on getting the supports that she needs together.
Awesome.
To help her with that. But with the eventual, vision 2 years from now that she's creating a home of her own.
Right.
So excited to see how that unfolds.
I'm curious too.
I'll keep you in the loop.
Yeah. I mean, it is, I have to say it is, as much as it's challenging, it's also a lot of fun. So, it might be an option if somebody hasn't considered it yet.
For sure. Well, maybe let's jump back and forth here in terms of the findings that we find interesting. But I think we both found this one interesting. The top challenges that siblings face. So when looking at the results, mental health came in loud and clear as a top challenge that siblings face. And interestingly enough, it was actually the mental health of their brother or sister with a developmental disability. And then second to that was, in terms of highest frequency of responses, was mental health of their parents, or
right.
Of our parents, those being kind of the top two challenges that siblings are saying that they faced, followed by housing in third, managing relationships fourth, and then fifth being emotional supports for themselves. So what I've really found interesting with that is the challenges that we think that we're facing are really putting our brother and sister and then our parents' health before ours, right?
Right. Were you so surprised by this, Eric?
I was, yeah. I mean,
I
think it makes sense because of the way that we grew up, right? Always wanting to help or support others, especially our, first off our sibling and then second our parents. So when kind of thinking it through further, it makes sense.
And also the fact that, our brothers and sisters with developmental disabilities have a higher than average chance of having a mental health challenge as they get older it's obvious it's not lost on us either, right? Because that comes in first, the mental health of my brother and sister. So we know that people with developmental disabilities have, what is the figure? I think it's 3 to 4 times likely to have a mental health challenge as somebody who doesn't have a developmental disability.
Right. And this is where our friend Yona focuses in on and dual diagnosis and mental health.
Right. Thank God for that.
Yeah. What I found interesting though is, I guess my logical or analytical brain says we, as siblings, we can't support our brother or our sister or our parents unless we take care of ourselves first. So if we have poor health or poor mental health and we're struggling with our own issues, our own challenges, whatever that could be, whether it's diagnosed or not, and we're not attending to those, we can't really do a very good job of supporting our family members. So even though we rank those challenges higher for our brothers and sisters and our parents, their mental health, like I think the logical first step is let's take care of ourselves first, which isn't the easiest thing to do or to prioritize sometimes. But I think that's the most effective way that we can play a supporting role.
Exactly. Yeah, you have to take care of yourself first. I mean, it's so challenging to take care of our families or to support our families that if we're not strong in being able to do that, it's just not going to work out very well. I think also you're right in that observation that and you brought it up at the very beginning of this conversation, that we are groomed from a very young age to take care of others. And I think this is reflected in this finding that we are doing a great job of taking care of others.
Yeah, and there's so
not
many
ourselves.
so many positives that come with that, but there's also the downsides and risks. So if we're not aware of them, I think it can put us in a bad spot.
Right.
So hopefully just this conversation, I mean, I think it helps me even further my understanding of myself, but for those listening, maybe it creates a bit of awareness or brings that up from their unconscious level into their consciousness.
Right.
Yeah. So what other findings did you find interesting, Helen?
Okay. So the other finding I was really interested in was the level of intensity or experienced by age category. So we divided up the age categories in 20 to 29, 30 to 39, and so on. And you could see that in the 20s and 30s, the intensity of support was lower than in the 50s and 60s. So we asked siblings to rate it on a scale of 1 to 10. What is the intensity of support that they're providing their brothers and sisters? And like I said, the 20s, 30s, and even 40s were much lower. And then you see this jump in the 50s and 60s. What I found really interesting, and this may be generational differences, or it's not really generations here, but differences in age categories, is that the 20 to 29-year-olds were reporting that they were providing a little more of an intensity of support than, let's say, people in their 30s and in their 30s. And I thought, I wonder if that's because people have changed, that people in their 20s are more connected to their brothers and sisters than perhaps older folks. I'm not sure. My sense is that, I don't know if you saw, recently listened to Brian Goldman's White Coat, Black Art, where he was interviewing these young women in their 20s who are looking after their sister, who is a person with autism or on the autism spectrum. They were so involved and so in tune to their sister. And even though I was very close to my brother throughout my whole life, I was never that in tune. So that aware. These girls were quite remarkable, or these young women were quite remarkable. So I just wondered if there was, that's a reflection of how times are changing and how people's perspectives of disability are changing.
Yeah. I have a different hypothesis.
Let's hear it.
I don't have proof, but I have a hypothesis. So often in today's society, young people are going to college or university, they'll move out. And then once they graduate, it's not easy to find a job. Rent's expensive. They often move back in with their parents, where their brother or sister with a developmental disability is living. So because they're sharing that same living space, my hypothesis is that that's when they're providing more support because they're home.
Right.
And I can see that dropping in the 30 to 39 range, because by that time, most people are somewhat established. They've moved out of their parents' place again. They might be starting a family. So that's my guess.
Could be, yeah. We won't know unless somebody does a more detailed research into siblings. And that was actually one of our things that we were hoping would happen, is that there could be a broader national survey into the needs and challenges of siblings done on a larger scale, right?
For sure. So I guess the other one that was of interest to me was the top needs that siblings identified. And what they really identified were, I guess in general, the need for resources for their brother or sister or for their family. So the top responses being housing options, housing being the number one, or tied with funding, very close. And I guess finances, which is very similar to funding. So those being the top three responses, and really I think you can group those into resources. And then mental health for their brother or sister coming in right after that as a top need. So I think that this tells a story of families needing more support, more resources, and maybe even I think what kind of lumps into this or can be helpful is different ideas and different ways of thinking about things. Like we talked about earlier, right? Like we don't have to make the assumption that our sibling with a developmental disability is going to live with us. Why
Right.
not think about a home of their own, right? And that
Right.
doesn't have to mean, if we think about it creatively, it doesn't have to mean buying a house for them and going to the extent of renovating that house. It could just mean simply, what would anybody else do? Well, their first place, they'd probably rent an apartment, right? So what does that look like?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I found it interesting that the top needs were really resource based.
Which was so different than what was identified as the top challenge, which was heavily emotional and
Right.
mental health related.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and funding and finances is such a challenge. It's something that I know parents talk about a lot because I hear them when we're out at different events and then managing finances once the parents are gone. So again, we're not really sure what they mean when they identified top needs around finances, but you can imagine it's like having enough money to support their brother or sister with a developmental disability to have the life that they need
Right.
or want.
Yeah, so along with the findings, we have provided 8 recommendations, I believe, for people to think about. So for siblings to think about, for families to think about, for organizations to think about, for governments to think about. And what we're talking about here in terms of resources ties in really well with one of the recommendations that we have around poverty reduction. So I know this is something that you're pretty passionate about, Helen. Did you want to talk a bit about that recommendation?
Right. So we know that most people with developmental disabilities are going to live their lives in poverty because that's the way our system has been set up, that people are not allowed to, even if they have their own resources, able to lift themselves up much beyond the low income cutoff. And so what we're recommending is a comprehensive national funding approach to make sure that Canadian citizens have financial safeguards and that they're not going to be at the risk of poverty. And I know that there's much discussion around a guaranteed annual basic income, where we have some basic income pilots in Ontario, and I think Quebec is also doing some work around the minimum income program. I'm not sure if those are exactly the solutions, but ensuring that there is some kind of safeguard there where people are able to access their own resources if they have them, or not simply just not falling below the low income cutoff point. There's some other things that can happen, perhaps with the registered disability savings plan, making that easier to access or easier to use. So it's really recognizing and understanding that life in poverty is not a good life for people with developmental disabilities. And it also puts brothers and sisters at risk, who are leading the support, perhaps once the parents are gone. I know in our house, for the last 3 years since my mom died, and we've been working on all the different, trying to figure out all the different funding and finance tools and how to manage it so that you're observing rules, has been extremely challenging and has taken up a lot of my time. I guess the other piece about that, whenever I mention this, that there's some kind of challenge, people always say, well, I know a guy who has this, that, and the other. And I think, well, that's not the way it should be. You shouldn't have like some secret resource, even if it is. I don't know if it is because I never follow up on those, but it shouldn't be that way. It should be that it's clear, that it's solid, that there's a way of doing it, that of managing finances or accessing finances and funding that works. And it works also nationwide. I don't know why we always have to divide things up by province and territory. So really our big recommendation here is to come forward with a comprehensive national funding approach.
Mm-hmm. And to make it easy and clear so people can understand it and benefit from it. And Helen, I just want to acknowledge you here on this point around poverty and supporting people that are in poverty with a disability, and really for your work that you did with gifts and assets and changing ODSP in Ontario. So maybe could you briefly, yeah, you're welcome. And again, just grateful from all the families out there. So much gratitude for the work that you did on that. And can you just give a very short overview of the change that you were able to invoke there?
Sure. So we wanted to try and change the rules of ODSP to mirror what was happening in British Columbia, where a person with a disability could hold $100,000 in assets and be gifted an unlimited amount. That's what was happening in British Columbia. Here in Ontario, a person with a disability could only hold $5,000 in assets and be gifted $6,000 a year. So through the work that we did with an effective advisory committee and then pulling together a significant coalition of about 50 different organizations, hundreds of individuals, and different champions and advocates, we did lobby the government of Ontario, and they did make a change. It wasn't the change that we were looking for, but it might be a good first step where they changed the assets that a person could hold to $40,000. So that's up from $5,000 to $40,000. And then they changed the gifts from $6,000 to $10,000. So while, we're always really grateful for any sort of positive changes that come out of the government of Ontario, it wasn't what we were looking for. And we'll see what happens after this next election. We might see if there's some more work that we can do around that to get it to a more significant change that really means poverty alleviation for those who are receiving Ontario disability support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, those are pretty significant changes. Like $40,000 might not seem like a lot, but it's a lot more than $5,000.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Well, those rules, I think, were created at a time when people with disabilities perhaps were not working as much as they are now. Right. And then also we have to consider inheritances and different changes to finances and funding when parents pass away. Although I have to say in our family, there was no real change in funding, which I found amazing. So I remember going in Ontario, we have the developmental services. And I remember going to them after my mom died and saying, my brother is now essentially orphaned. And there's, is there any way that we can get a few more passport dollars or some supported independent living or something to help me help my brother live a good life now that his primary supports are no longer there. And I have to say, nothing changed. So just as a heads up to brothers and sisters out there that just because your parents pass away doesn't mean that developmental services is going to respond to you any differently. In fact, they're not going to.
Yeah.
In my experience anyway, it's very frustrating.
Yeah, it sounds like it was and still is. So
yes.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. And I think the other thing that you brought up, needing to have a guy or a person to go figure out the right solution here in terms of finances and resources for your family or your brother and sister. I think just some simple things that siblings should definitely educate themselves about are the RDSP. I think
For sure.
in most cases, that's pretty much a no-brainer. There's free money available there, or I'll call it free money, but government money available there for people with disabilities. And then the other thing to look about, especially when it comes to like inheritances and things like that, is in Ontario, it's called a Henson Trust. Outside of Ontario, it's mostly referred to as a discretionary trust. And that is a way essentially to hold assets for your brother or sister with the developmental disability, especially when it gets over in Ontario, once you're over that $40,000 mark.
Right. You still have to know for Henson Trusts, you need to have your eyes wide open around how to use your Henson Trusts, and even going and setting one up. I mean, we could do a whole other podcast on that story alone about how to go and set up a Henson Trust inside a bank. So you need to be very, very aware, and remembering at that time when you're doing those things, you're under a lot of duress. I was, deeply grieving, worrying, and then you're doing these like really significant financial transactions. So it's not a time to do that kind of thing alone. You need support to do that. So, we're going down a bit of a rabbit hole, and there's so many of them. But we need, we don't need that guy. We don't need that special guy who knows a special something. What we need is a good national plan to alleviate and keep people with disabilities out of poverty, because again, that affects the financial situation of brothers and sisters who end up in the supporting role one day as well. I won't lie, it's a financial pressure.
Yes, exactly. So I think I'll take your cue there, and we've exhausted this one, or maybe not exhausted it, but talked quite a bit about it. So let's share a couple of other recommendations that we have. One that really resonates with me, and I think it really helped to form the connection that you and I have and that we have with Becky, is for adult siblings to connect with other adult siblings, to share their experiences and their life story. It is interesting in a conversation with Don Mayer, who is, I'll call a sibling expert, or someone that has served the sibling community in the United States and actually all over the world for the past 30, 35 years or so. One thing that he shared with me, and it made a lot of sense, is that siblings, especially adult siblings, just don't connect with each other to share their experiences, which is really weird when you compare it to the experience of a parent, because parents are connecting with each other essentially as soon as their son or daughter is born, or at an early age of diagnosis. They're going to medical appointments, they're going to programs for people with disabilities, and parents are connecting with each other and sharing in the experience as a parent, but siblings aren't having that same experience. And I'll share for myself, I mean, as a sibling, it's not always easy to share some of the experiences that I'm having with my family, with my friends, because sometimes I feel like they just won't get it, or they don't understand because they haven't been through it. And sharing my experience with you, Helen, it was like, yeah, she gets me.
Mm-hmm. And then there's connecting with siblings whose parents have passed away, and they are in the role of providing full support. That too is a very special journey. And I've only connected with one other person who's in the same shoes as me. And we don't get a chance to connect very much, even though our brothers and sister belong to the same organization, because we're both so busy. But sometimes they sit us at the same table and we get to chat. But it's really important to connect. And when I meet other brothers and sisters who are on the same journey, it's always such a relief, and it's so validating. Although I have to say here, Eric, though, that there's two kinds of conversations, or maybe there's more than two, but the reason why you and Becky and I connect is because of a certain set of values. And we connect because we have some. Should I talk about the values of our collective here?
Yeah, maybe. I think it's. I mean, we've already gone down the path, so let's talk
Right.
about the Sibling Collaborative.
Wait. Let me say what I'd like to say. What the two different conversations
Okay.
are.
Okay, go, and then you can go into the Sibling Collaborative.
Okay. So the two, I am not interested, and I don't think you or Becky were either, in having a discussion around burden or the burden narrative of our brothers and sisters. And our values and the way that we talk to each other and why we connect is because of our compassion and our respect and for our brothers and sisters, and that we're proud to be on this journey with them. And that really has informed how the Sibling Collaborative has come together. Our main purpose of the Sibling Collaborative is to connect siblings and strengthen families. So we believe by siblings connecting with other siblings and learning and growing through those connections, that we are strengthening families. Mm-hmm. And Eric, do you want to talk a little bit about values?
Yeah, so we've put together some common values, which Helen already gave you a bit of a sneak peek into. And so there's 4 values that we put together that we really believe in, and these are the types of values that we would want people to embrace that are interested in becoming a part of the Sibling Collective, whether you're a sibling, another family member, a person with a developmental disability, or you're an organization that's interested in supporting siblings. So really so the first value being realizing change with compassion. So we really feel it's important that we're taking action towards living the lives that we want to live, and taking that creative mindset to do so, and to doing that with compassion and including our brothers and sisters and our families in making those decisions and in that change. So that being the first value. The second one, which Helen touched on, is respect or mutual respect. So we give people agency over their own lives. We give our brothers and sisters agency, empowerment over their own lives, and we take into consideration with all those people involved in what we're doing, and in those change that might be happening, and the impact that it might have on their lives. The third value is collective solutions. So we're all about finding a way forward, and doing that by learning, working, and co-creating together as a collective. And the fourth one is unlocking potential. So often our brothers and sisters or people with developmental disabilities have very low expectations put on them. And as brothers and sisters, as organizations, as family members, we have the opportunity to hold this really big, bold vision for our brothers and sisters and our families. And we just have this amazing capability to be creative and resourceful. And there aren't really any limits to that. So those are the values and the mindsets that we hold as a collective. So does that give a good overview, Helen? Is there anything you want to add, or maybe that I missed? Okay.
That's awesome. Thank you for articulating that so well. So it's just a really important part of this conversation, is that we are not viewing this as a burden, but something that we are an opportunity, and an opportunity certainly with challenges, but an opportunity where we can make some big changes.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm excited to talk a bit more about the Sibling Collaborative and where we're going with it, but let's kind of keep that as a teaser for a moment. There's a couple of more recommendations that that I think we wanted to share before that. So did you want to share the one around mental health, Helen? I know that one's pretty important to us.
Oh, yeah, sure. So it sort of speaks to it does speak to the findings that we talked about earlier, where we we know that people with intellectual disabilities or developmental disabilities face a rate of mental illness that's 3 to 4 times higher than the general population. So we want that to be it is our recommendation that be recognized and integrated into how people with developmental disabilities are seen in the healthcare system, maybe inside developmental services or organizations that work with families and people with developmental disabilities as well. So we're not going to escape that. So we actually were pretty specific. We wanted incorporating the issue of mental health to be part of the developmental services sector, what we just talked about, different organizations. We want the developmental services sector to build capacity around mental health with individuals with a developmental disability. And we also think that needs to happen throughout the lifespan. So if you start building a strong base when our brothers and sisters are young, and that they can grow up resilient and strong, we hope, and reducing any kind of possibilities of mental health crisis when they get older. And just recognizing that this is part of our life. We can't escape it, and we need it to be included in the conversation. And actually, more importantly than that, it's not just a conversation piece. We need tools. We need resources and information and support services to help deal with the mental health crisis.
Yeah. And I think what stands out for me is the solution isn't just to give people that are diagnosed with mental health challenges psychotropic meds.
No.
And
Thank you.
Our friend Yona has done a fair amount of research on this and people being given medication that they don't really need.
Mm-hmm. More to manage quote unquote behaviors, as opposed to really understanding what's going on. And I think in all fairness, there hasn't been a lot of research done into that yet. And that's why we're so privileged to have Yona, as an advisor to this project, because this is her area of expertise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's so important. And I know that you're actually doing a talk around resilience coming up, which I'm actually going to be. I'm going to be there to watch you live.
Oh,
by the
yay!
way.
I'm so excited. That's great.
So I know that mental health and the whole resilience piece is important to you and dear to your heart. So I'm excited to see some of the work that you produce with that.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, now I'm worried.
Now the people on the podcast can go watch the video of you as well, or they can come to the live event in Toronto. It's April
19th, okay. And it's on the Partners for Planning website. It's called The Art of Resilience. And to watch it live by webcast is actually free, I think. I think it'll be a really good event. And I really appreciate that Partners for Planning is holding this around such a positive topic, the topic of resilience. So I'll look forward to sharing some of my insights around that and how our family and how me, Paul, and my husband, Stefan, have managed to come through some very, very hard times. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to see that talk. And is Paul going to be on stage with you for that?
Yes. And I have to say that's the other thing I deeply appreciate, that in lieu of just having me talk, that we were invited to co-present. So we're both looking forward to presenting together about how we both have supported each other and come through our hard times together.
Awesome. Excited to see that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so maybe we can just share one more recommendation and then we'll get into more of the sibling collab and where we're going with that and how people can get involved. So for me, I guess these two recommendations are tied together somewhat around the theme of conversation. And Helen, you mentioned this earlier, I think a couple of times in the podcast, or you mentioned it specifically around your situation, is you weren't really included in the plan that your parents had for Paul.
Mm-hmm.
And, as your story unfolds, you share that really you had, once your parents were no longer there for Paul, you just had to start from square one and create the plan, or try and pick up the pieces of what was there and stitch together a plan.
Right.
And it sounds like that was extremely challenging.
I think my dad had a plan. My dad always had a plan. He just forgot to ask me if that plan suited me and if that's something I wanted to do.
Or show you the plan.
Or showing would have been great. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so whatever they had intended is not what has happened. I don't think that's actually unusual. I think that you can create the most elaborate plans in the world and they may or may not come true, right? Especially if you're expecting somebody else to execute them. I think the one thing that my parents did well, and I'm deeply grateful for this, and I know that they were inspired by plan to do this very well, which was to take care of their financial future. So I think my parents were one of the first people in Ottawa to open an RDSP, and they saved really hard so that Paul could have a Henson trust that I could access as he needed. So they did do the financial planning piece right, and I think that's a very concrete and tangible piece to know what to do. It's the rest of the life planning, like the housing, the funding, the supports, all those kind of things. We most certainly started from scratch, and I kind of feel like we start from scratch on a regular basis on that one.
Right. Yeah. So what we're really recommending is that whoever is going to be involved in executing that plan, which more than likely is a sibling, to include them in that conversation. We recommend that it's a family conversation, or it's a family and friends conversation, including that, including your brother and sister or sister that has a developmental disability.
For sure. Yes.
And to be open about that and to craft that together to make sure everybody's aligned with that plan. Because if you're not, right, I mean, even if your parents, if the parents create a plan and the sibling or the siblings say like, this plan is stupid, they're going to go do something else anyways. So why even create it?
Exactly. I think that it must be a very difficult conversation to have. I know that when my parents sometimes would mention, oh, well, you can move in here or whatever, I probably didn't make it easy for them to have that conversation with me. I think I remember sort of running away whenever that came up, because the prospect of your parents not being here is very difficult and a very sad thought. So, there's mediators and people who have expertise in mediating those kind of conversations. So if it is really hard for a family, I think it'd be worthwhile having a mediator involved. And I wish we had done that. I wish we had some experts helping guide the conversation so that I would listen and that we could have had a better talk about it.
Yeah. And these aren't easy conversations.
No.
I think they can be over time, but to start it off, it's, how do I approach that? And the idea of having a mediator or a facilitator to help with that conversation, I think can be definitely very valuable.
Right.
There's also a quote that comes to mind from Mike Tyson, actually, the boxer. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. Right.
And I was actually just going to say something very similar, is that it's not one conversation.
Yes.
Because we get punched in the face over and over and over again in life. And so that conversation needs to be ongoing as things change. People get married, people get divorced, people have children, people, things, they have to move for work. Things change all the time.
Exactly.
And so it's an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, that plan's going to evolve, right? And I think kind of so that communication theme ties into the next recommendation that I wanted to talk about, is really around recommending that organizations that support families of an individual that has a developmental disability to directly communicate with siblings and to use language that includes siblings, whether that's an invitation to a service or to a meeting or to an information night, whatever that may be, to be inclusive and to directly communicate with siblings so that they feel invited. Because so often as a sibling, it's, oh, my parents are going off to this, they're going off to that, to learn about things. And that information somewhat gets filtered back through my parents, but it's so diluted that I don't really get much value from it. Yeah. Do you want to add anything to that one?
Well, yeah, I think I think just opening the conversation more broadly, because, we are saying, well, a lot of conversations are only about parents, and now we're saying include the siblings, but the fact of the matter is that there may also be other people who are going to be the primary supporters that need to be included in that conversation as well. So just, not every family is just the parents, and to just sort of widen that scope to include more people.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So that gives a really good snapshot of a lot of the findings and the work and the research that we've done so far, and some recommendations that we've created. And we've done all this work so far, and really because we're passionate about it. And there's still so much more work that we want to do. And a lot of these recommendations, we want to put some more blood, sweat, and tears into making some of this stuff happen. So as Helen and I have talked about, that's why we've created the sibling collaboration. And the purpose of the sibling collaboration, as Helen shared, to connect siblings so that they can share in their experiences and share learning, and to strengthen families. So Helen, maybe there's a good opportunity for us to share some of the things that we're working on and where we're going.
So we heard from siblings through the survey that they really wanted to have a place to go to find information about their supporting role with their brother and sister. So I guess over the next little while, the Sibling Collaborative is going to look at evolving some online information. So Partners for Planning will kindly be hosting our report and perhaps some resources as well. But over time, we'll try and build that into something comprehensive and interesting and viable for siblings. And I guess, Eric, we have to go full loop to the whole conference idea, don't we?
Yes.
Because that's where this started. This whole thing started with the idea of holding a sibling conference. And that's something we would still like to do. But I think what Eric and Becky and I realized is that it's not anything that we can do alone. It's something that we need to do with an organization. So we are opening the conversation, or we're open to any conversation with organizations who are interested in fully or partially or in part supporting a sibling conference. And we did get confirmation through the survey that indeed siblings do want to get together, and the area where they'd like to get together is in the GTA. So that's what we have in our long-term view, Eric?
Yeah. And for those of you outside of Ontario, GTA, Greater Toronto area.
Oh, sorry.
It's all good.
It's the center of the universe. I think everybody knows that, right?
Right. If you're from Toronto, it is. Well, then, if you're from Toronto, would you say GTA, or you'd probably just be like, Toronto is the center of the universe?
I don't know.
But
I live in Ottawa, so.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the other thing maybe to add is, even in the absence of a larger amount of funding for a conference or a partnership with organizations to hold a conference, we're still planning on doing some meetups to test some of the content and to test the idea of connecting siblings, and to learn from that, to roll that into a conference. And there's a few more things that we're looking at testing, and which, things like peer-to-peer mentoring with adult sibling to adult sibling, and creating some content around resiliency, which I know you're already working on with your talk, Helen, but continuing down that vein. And, we're also interested in creating some content around helping siblings to bring a creative mindset into their lives and into their families' lives, and thinking about designing helping their sibling design their life and to create a fulfilling life for them and their families. So there's lots of things that we're interested in working on and working toward. So if any organizations are interested in partnering in those things and either have some resources that they'd like to share or contribute towards that, then we would love to have those conversations.
Right. And I think that's why we called it the Sibling Collaborative, because we want to collaborate with others, whether it's other individuals or organizations that share our values, to work towards supporting siblings to help their brothers and sisters have a good life.
Yeah, for sure. So if there's folks interested in connecting with us, so either adult siblings or family members or organizations, Helen, what is the best way for them to do that?
Well, there's a couple of ways. One is to join the Facebook page that we mentioned at the beginning. We called it the Sibling Network because it was created before we got the Sibling Collaborative together. We'll see about changing that name, but for now it's called, you can look for it on Facebook as the Sibling Network. You can also join our email list, which is at the bottom of the report. When you get the report, you'll be able to see it there. Or you can reach out by email at info@siblingcollaborative.org. And of course, if none of those work and you end up finding me or Eric on Twitter or Facebook, you can also just shoot us an email or a message and we can guide you to the right place.
Fantastic. And I'll include all of that in the show notes of the podcast and in the blog.
Thank you.
Yeah. So it's been a pleasure doing this podcast with you today, Helen. Is there any final thoughts that you want to leave the listeners with?
I do, actually, Eric. I saw somewhere a quote, and I wish I could remember who, and I can't, but it said that if you want to invest in the long-term well-being of people with developmental disabilities, you need to invest in their brothers and sisters. And I just think that quote sort of sums up everything that we've been working towards.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I believe that we can attribute that quote to our good friend Don Mayer.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad you know.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, that's a great way to wrap up the podcast. So again, a pleasure chatting with you today, Helen. And
thanks, Eric.
Looking forward to continuing to move forward with the Sibling Collaborative. And I hope that our listeners today check out the report and consider how they might want to contribute with the Sibling Collaborative, or even hopefully just at least some ideas to take back to their family. So,
right. Great. Thank you, Eric, for putting this together.
My pleasure. All right, Helen, we will chat soon.
Okay, talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye. So a big thank you to Helen for coming on to the podcast today, and a big thank you for including me in this idea, in this work that we're both super passionate about, and we are on a mission to make a difference in this world for adult siblings, for people with disabilities, and for families. So super exciting work. Excited to bring you next week's podcast, or 2 weeks from now's podcast with Nick Maisie. And Nick is a gentleman out of Perth, Australia. And I was introduced to Nick through our mutual friend, Janet Cleese. So thank you for that introduction, Janet. Nick started an organization called Befriend, which helps people that are looking for friendship to find friendship. So it's not just necessarily people with disabilities. And in late 2017, Nick went on a fellowship that took him across the world, several different countries, visiting several different groups in search of answers on a couple of questions, really focusing in on what the building blocks to belonging and being in relationship are. And Nick shares his stories and his insights that he's been able to synthesize and take away from that experience. It's a super interesting conversation. If you're interested in community and relationships, I think you're going to love this podcast, so I suggest checking it out. That's all from me. Cheers for now. Big love. Adios. Talk to you in a couple weeks. And thank you so much for listening to the podcast today. If you like this episode and you think you know someone that would benefit, please share it with them. Be a part of the change to think differently about disability.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast. Visit us at empoweringability.org for more podcasts and resources to help you and your loved ones impacted by disability build a full and meaningful life.